Good morning, my name is Adrian Buffa and I will be presenting Part AI of the Moraleto Park Integration Project. The presentation will briefly cover the co-design process from Phase 4 onwards. The focus of this investigation is the facilitation of spatial agency through co-design, co-authorship and development of flexible public amenities. An overview of the co-design process and outcomes will be provided, structured according to the project phases. First, some key information will be introduced. The project is located primarily in Cemetery View, adjacent to the grounds where the Imvelo project is projected to take place. This provides a brief overview of the co-design methodology and tools used. This diagram represents the main stakeholders and organizations consulted. The larger the icon, the more consideration was given to their input. Much consideration was given to the needs and aspirations of the settlement's residents as determined in Quarter 1, as they could not be directly involved in the process. To begin, I will provide a brief reminder of the first phase of conceptual development to contextualize the preliminary concept. This shows the engagement methodology and tools used, as well as the 3 engagements that took place throughout the week. The list of limitations and challenges that was produced with stakeholders was used in conjunction with the stakeholders' projected outcomes and problems identified by community members in Quarter 1 to determine the main issues to be addressed. Group A was formed to respond to the intertwined issues of health, water and sanitation, and social development. The preliminary concept developed for the project related to health support and provision of public space, with an emphasis on ideas of ownership, accessibility, and spatial justice. It was important to respond to physical boundaries between Cemetery View and the Imvelo pilot project, to explore new conceptions of edge conditions and ensure accessibility for the community, an issue which stakeholders noted is important. To this end, theories relating to the privatization of public space in South Africa, constructs of scarcity, and facilitation of spatial agency were explored. Additionally, in response to the ever-changing needs of informal settlements and flexibility required for stakeholder interventions, Jumi's conception of event architecture was consulted. This theory also surfaced important implications for agency and authorship within the design process. The next phase, co-evaluation of primary ideas, sought to evaluate the proposed concepts and their contextual possibilities. The engagement methodology for this week used several tools to create a common design language to stimulate stakeholder input. 3 engagements were held with relevant stakeholders. During these engagements, precedent studies were used to expose stakeholders to the spatial possibilities available and create a common design language between them and the designers. Following the discussion of precedents, mural was used to capture the spatial ideas of stakeholders on an aerial photo of the site. These ideas and proposed programs were then interpreted by the members of Group A in a separate mural session. These inputs were then formalized on site maps and combined to identify overlaps and conflicts. In addition, the projected stakeholder outcomes were weighted and ranked, with emphasis placed on the community needs identified in Quarter 1. Next, the stakeholders' proposed programs were weighted, and additional sources of information relating to site use, construction guidelines, and prototype interventions were identified. This information was used to propose a preliminary spatial intervention in plan and section with reference to the existing concept proposal. An excerpt from South Africa's Bill of Rights was also included to validate the project outcomes with relation to human rights and dignity. Finally, a diagram was developed to visually express the critical position of the intervention within the discourse of spatial agency. Parts of the process are related to authorship, emergence, and the professional and user realms. Following the initial spatial proposal, contextual co-design development took place. This week focused on contextual analysis of construction within Cemetery View to enrich proposals. 2 peer engagements took place and 1 stakeholder engagement was held. First, a scale diagram was developed to guide massing on site. Next, an in-depth analysis of construction techniques present on site was conducted. This was condensed into a summary diagram showing the predominant structural system within the settlement. The spatial proposal was then further developed with focus on construction and materiality. An investigation of programming was also conducted and presented in the stakeholder engagement using an elevation diagram. At the end of this phase, the intervention had become fairly controlled and self-contained, at odds with the initial conception of an intervention which allowed flexible development and projection of authorship through use or event. This warranted further consideration, which brings us into the final phase of the process, revision of design. This phase consisted primarily of peer review and discussion, as well as final stakeholder engagements. 3 peer-to-peer meetings were held and 2 stakeholder engagements took place. Peer engagements consisted mainly of mural sessions, during which site plans were overlaid to identify overlaps and consolidate spatial proposals. Next, a personal reflection on the process took place with emphasis on the theoretical framework, concept proposal, and the main spatial ideas extracted from stakeholder engagements. Several explorations were completed, referring back to stakeholders' ideas of a physical walkway, gathering space at the entrance of the settlement, and a health post to serve the community. These site explorations were overlaid in relation to the group's other proposed interventions, and a more refined site proposal was produced. The ideas for the scheme to be developed in phases, responding to the conception of now, soon, and later. Construction techniques within Cemetery View were examined again, and a composite structural system using locally available timber posts was developed. This system would allow flexible introduction and removal of cladding panels without the need for permanent fixing, resulting in interventions which could shift with the needs of the community. The first phase of the intervention would consist of the collaborative implementation of a health post and the roof and floor of a community center using the proposed flexible structural system. In addition, 2 small-scale interventions would be completed in collaboration with the university's JCP Community Outreach Program. These interventions would require the construction of a flexible screen structure to test the proposed structural system. University students and community members could collaborate to create screen panels using recycled materials to create patterns and planters. This would allow community members to explore the proposed structural system and experiment with different types of panels on a small scale. Following this initial exploration, a larger structural grid would be laid out between Cemetery View and the Imvelo project, creating a physical link between the two. This framework could then be infilled by the community to create flexible, emergent public spaces which suit their needs. Using stories describing the daily lives of residents within Plastic View and Cemetery View collected in Q1, possible user groups and uses for the walkway space were projected. Furthermore, aspirational stories told by residents were used to explore skills development and other opportunities within the spaces. The planter, who aspires to own a nursery, could implement growing spaces along the walkway and facilitate the development of a small-scale nursery for the greater Moraletta Park area. The carpenter could create seating, shelving, and balustrades to support public spaces. These could additionally be sold, providing his business with the exposure and growth he hopes for. Finally, the seamstress could create installations such as stage curtains and retractable shading to facilitate events and help reach her goal of becoming a fashion designer. It is hoped that the walkway could be used as a testing ground for residents to share skills and develop new construction techniques in collaboration with stakeholders. These techniques could eventually be used to construct and infill support spaces, such as a clinic or communal washing area, encouraging collaboration between stakeholders and community members. This would ensure that the development and use of the spaces remain in the hands of the residents who inhabit them. To conclude, the intervention has shifted through the co-design process from a static imposition of formal programs to a flexible system which allows emergence and community-driven development. The flexibility of spaces and emphasis on dynamic use allows a transition of authorship from designer to user. Although the input of the community itself was absent during the initial design process, the construction, use, and appropriation of spaces ensures that the co-design dialogue continues throughout occupation. This may be a start to providing marginalized groups with a larger degree of spatial agency.